Dads are notorious for having a no-nonsense viewpoint of life. Dads are all about practicality. For instance, one dad said, essential oils are for frying wings and French fries. All other oils are non-essential. See, it's just a practical look at life, focusing on the practical. That's why dads tend to ignore emotions and deal bluntly with a problem. For example, the dad is the parent who advises his son who's been hit by a pitch to just walk it off. Or a son who has scraped his knee has rubbed some dirt in it. Or a son who feels like crying, just be a man. Put on your big boy pants and deal with it. Some might consider, therefore, dad's advice to be gruff and callous. But it's actually his way of preparing his children to face the difficulties of life. Dad has level-headed advice for daughters, too. When his daughter hit a Mercedes and broke a taillight during a driving lesson, one dad said, "Stop crying. We can pay for the damage. But next time, hit a Ford." See, good practical advice, right? Another dad told his 7th grade daughter before her first school dance, if a boy tries to dance with you, punch him in the throat. I like that, Dad. Now, a mom would never say those things, right? Moms are more refined and more proper. Moms are more sensitive to their children's feelings. And so in comparison, Dad's advice might appear to be something that we shouldn't really take seriously. Comedian Jim Gaffigan says that dads are like a backup quarterback in the NFL. They're on the team, but they are not the star player. And on those rare occasions when they do get in the game, everyone is nervous. Is he going to handle this right? Yeah, probably not. He'll be insensitive, and he'll make some dumb joke about the situation because that's what dads do. By the way, to let you in on a little secret, that whole dad joke thing, we know they are corny jokes. They're not great humor. But the fact that they irritate our children, we get enjoyment out of that. And so, as you can see, dads are callous to a certain degree. There's a certain callousness that comes along with being a dad. And fathers, we get this instruction, therefore, from the Bible. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. So maybe it's time to give dad a little dad advice. You know, practical advice which places its value on wisdom, even at the expense of being a bit insensitive to his feelings. Let's read that verse that I quoted just a moment ago, found in Ephesians 6:4. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Now, various translations for that word exasperate you read on the screen there. Various other translations will offer synonyms like provoke or irritate or aggravate or stir to anger. We understand what this verse is saying, don't we? That instruction had to be included in the Bible because dads know how to push buttons and should refrain from doing so when it isn't necessary. That word exasperate that we just read, in the original language of the New Testament, the Greek language, is actually a compound word. It's comprised of two different words, one meaning to cause anger, and the other meaning close beside. And so when they're combined, the word exasperate means to push someone to the point of anger from someone who is close to that person and should be supportive and encouraging instead. That's the idea of the word exasperate. That concept is brought out a little bit more clearly when we read the parallel verse to this that Paul wrote to the Christians in Colossae in Colossians 3:21, when he wrote, "Fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged." I like the way the Contemporary English Version brings that verse out. Fathers, do not be hard on your children. If you are, they might give up. And fathers are capable of either of those, aren't they? They can, on the one hand, provoke and aggravate and create frustration so that their children give up easily when they face defeat. Or they can be the kind of father who encourages and uplifts, instilling confidence in their child, so their children will learn how to battle through adversity and overcome it. We are capable, dads, of doing either of those things. There's a great power that exists within our role as the father of the family. We can be a transforming influence to our children. So, Dad, be a spiritual leader in your home. The Old Testament patriarch Abraham had 2 sons. God promised him 1 son, but he had 2. Through that 1 son that God promised, God said would come the nation of Israel. God made that promise to Abraham when he was 75 years old and childless. And then God tested Abraham's faith and his patience by waiting to fulfill that promise. He waited for 10 years. After 10 years of waiting, Sarah, Abraham's wife, became impatient. And so she said, "You need to become a father." He was 85 years old. I bet he's the only 85-year-old man who ever heard those words spoken to him. I hope I don't hear those words spoken to me when I am 85. But Sarah and Abraham had lost faith and patience in God's promise. And so Sarah came up with a plan of her own. She was going to try to kick God's promise in higher gear so that it would be fulfilled a little faster. When God wasn't coming along with his fulfillment as quickly as she thought, she came up with this plan as we read in Genesis 16, 1 through 4. Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abraham, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abraham had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. Does that sound like God's plan to you? God's plan was stated in the very beginning when in the book of Genesis chapter 2, he said 1 man and 1 woman will define marriage for life. What usually happens when we ignore God's plan and substitute our own instead? It oftentimes ends in disaster, doesn't it? And so it did in this case. Let's continue where we left off reading in verse 4 of Genesis 16. When Hagar knew she was going to have a baby, she became proud and treated Sarah hatefully. Then Sarah said to Abraham, "It's all your fault. I gave you my slave woman, but she has been hateful to me ever since she found out she was pregnant. You have done me wrong, and you will have to answer to the Lord for this." And I read it, I'm thinking, what? And then I read this, and some of this just seems vaguely familiar to me. It's the part where Sarah said to Abraham, "It's all your fault." Seems like I hear that a lot at my house. It's all my fault. When my children were rude and crude and acting out, it was my fault. And then 20 years later, when my grandchildren were also acting up and they were rude and crude, it was still my fault. And it seems like practically everything terrible that happened in between was somehow could be traced back to me, and it was my fault. Can you identify with that, dads? There should be a verse in the Bible that says, "Wives, do not exasperate your husbands." Can I get an amen from anybody? No husbands are bold enough to amen that statement. I get that. You can tell me that in private. Sarah made life miserable. You know how it goes, right? When mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And I think nobody was happy in that household. But she especially made things miserable for her slave woman, Hagar. She made it so miserable for Hagar that Hagar ran away from home. She didn't know where to go, had nobody of her own. She had been deported from her homeland hundreds of miles away. Here she was, in very real ways, a woman in trouble, and she had nowhere to turn, and she ended up in the desert. An angel sent from God found her there, and he knew the pain that she had been subjected to. He knew the fears that must have been in her heart. And so through that angel, God gave Hagar this promise in Genesis 16, verses 11 and 12. The angel of the Lord said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." And then he convinced her to return, and she did. She returned to Abraham's household, and Ishmael was born into that household. He was a child with a promise, but he was not the child of promise. And I'm sure through the years at every stage, he was made to feel like he was not the child of promise. 14 years later, Isaac was born to Abraham and Sarah. He was the child of promise. Isaac was weaned at about age 4, and Abraham and Sarah threw a big party for him. Ishmael was about 18 at the time, and he was jealous and hurt. They were making a big to-do about this little 4-year-old boy and ignoring him. This toddler was already starting to push him further out to the perimeter of the family. He was seeing that he was being replaced. All the attention, all this party was for this little guy, but nothing for him. And there was a confrontation brewing, and it erupted. And we read that in Genesis 21, verses 8 through 10. On the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son. For that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." And then verse 11 tells us, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. Ishmael was his son, but not Sarah's son. And so he was to be treated as an outcast, according to Sarah. And Abraham was at fault in this. Sarah was right to a degree, because he did not take spiritual leadership. As this division was growing, as this animosity was increasing between those two women and involving Abraham's son Ishmael, he didn't do anything to bring healing into the family. He allowed that rift to grow until it successfully separated the family. We read in verse 14 of that chapter, "Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba." The Bible story then goes on in the next several verses to tell us that in short time, Hagar and Ishmael ran out of food and water. They were there in the desert, alone, without help. Their situation was hopeless. They were growing weaker with dehydration. It came to the point that Ishmael had no strength left at all. She pulled him over and laid him in the shade of a bush, and then she crawled away, unable to watch him die. She cried out to God, and he heard her. And he again sent an angel, providing sustenance for them both. And somehow, surely through God's providence, they survived and they found a way to live in that desert environment. And the scriptures tell us that Ishmael grew up in the desert of Paran. And Ishmael never forgot. He never forgot Sarah's resentment of him. He never forgot that his father failed to stand up for him. He never forgot that he had been pushed out of the family. He never forgot that he was second in place to his half-brother Isaac. He never forgot that he was no longer welcome in Abraham's household. And so we read this in verses 20 and 21 of Genesis 21. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. The desert of Paran. The city of Mecca is in the desert of Paran. You might know that city as the capital city of Islam. You see, Ishmael became the father of the Arabic nations and the spiritual father of the Islamic people who have forever been at war with Israel and with the allies of Israel. That prophecy about Ishmael, about being in opposition continually with his brothers, being living in hostility with them, that has been fulfilled in every century since then, because Abraham pushed his son away and did not treat him as a godly father should. There's some lessons in that story, isn't there, dads, for us? When we choose our way instead of God's way, when we choose to act in ungodliness toward others, it's going to come back and haunt us. If we raise our children in ungodly ways in which God has not put first, his values are not held high, it's going to come back and haunt us. Dads, lead your children in God's ways. Make good decisions for them based on spiritual values, and then instill those values in your children so that they will continue to live those values and teach them to their children. Dads, be an encourager and a supporter. Give your children your time. Let them know by that they are important to you. Teach them by your example that they have value. This generation of fathers is actually very good at that. This generation of fathers are more likely to be at the recitals and the performances and the sporting events and the activities of their children than some previous generations of fathers were. This generation of fathers is good at building self-esteem in their children. They are good at encouraging. They are good at supporting their children in their every endeavor. Well done, dads, for being there for and with your children. But Paul's teaching about fathers didn't stop with merely be an encourager. We saw that in Ephesians 6:4 earlier, didn't we? Let's look at it again and focus on the last half of that verse. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. This generation of fathers has failed more miserably at that than fathers in some previous generations. This generation of fathers is less likely to be in church with their children each Sunday than many fathers in the past. They are less likely to read Bible stories to their children and pray with them. They are less likely to make sure that their children are in Sunday school or in youth programs which are designed to give them a greater foundation for their faith than past fathers were. You see, while this generation of fathers has been very supportive, these fathers have faltered at providing consistent spiritual leadership for their children. Eugene Peterson translated Ephesians 6:4 with these words: Fathers, take them by the hand and lead them all the way to the Master. That's your calling, Dad. Give your children a faith that will strengthen them. Give them a faith that will guide them safely through this life and with certainty into the next one. Give them a faith that they will teach to your grandchildren. Fathers, grandfathers, we are called to be the spiritual patriarchs of our families. The next line of leadership in the family and in God's church is in the developing stages now. They need the right kind of guidance. They need spiritual leaders to take them to the next level so they will be prepared to then teach their children who can then teach theirs. We are a chain link in a great chain that is used to serve God's purposes and bring about His will in millions of lives. So lead your children to God and be an example of Jesus to them. Step up, dads, and answer the call. Let's stand and sing our closing song.